For 50 years, two men shaped the entire history of computing from opposite ends of the same battlefield and never once stood in the same room. One of them built the software empire that put a computer on nearly every desk on the planet, running code you were never allowed to see or modify. The other built, largely alone at first, an operating system kernel that anyone on Earth could read, copy, and change, and gave it away for free. For half a century, Bill Gates and Linus Torvalds existed as the two poles of an entire industry's defining argument: closed versus open, proprietary versus free, without ever actually meeting each other in person. Then, in June of 2025, they finally did, over dinner, hosted, of all people, by a senior Microsoft executive. And the photograph that came out of that dinner is one of the strangest, most quietly historic images the tech industry has produced in years. It's worth being upfront about the timeline here before we go any further, because getting the facts right matters more than making this feel more urgent than it actually is. This dinner happened over a year ago now, not last week. It's not breaking news in the traditional sense. But it's a story genuinely worth revisiting in full because so much of the coverage at the time focused on the photo itself rather than the 50 years of history that made that photo so remarkable in the first place. And because understanding exactly why this meeting took so long to happen tells you almost everything you need to know about how deep the Windows versus Linux divide actually ran for most of both men's careers. Let's set the scene properly, because the details of exactly how this happened matter as much as the fact that it happened at all, and the specific circumstances of this dinner reveal quite a bit about how these kinds of historic moments actually come together in the tech industry, often far more casually than the eventual headlines would suggest. The dinner was organized by Mark Russinovich, the Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft Azure, himself a legendary figure in the Windows world, the co-creator of tools like sysinternals that generations of IT professionals have relied on to understand what's actually happening inside a Windows machine. Russinovich posted a photo from the evening on LinkedIn, and the caption he wrote is worth repeating in full because it captures the almost surreal, understated tone of the entire event. He wrote that he'd had the thrill of a lifetime hosting dinner for Bill Gates, Linus Torvalds, and David Cutler, adding that Linus had never met Bill and Dave had never met Linus. Then, in classic engineer deadpan humor, he added, "No major kernel decisions were made, but maybe next dinner." That single caption is doing an enormous amount of work, and it's worth unpacking. Each name in that sentence individually, because the significance of this dinner only becomes fully clear once you understand exactly who was sitting at that table and what each of their careers represented to the broader story of how personal computing actually developed. Bill Gates needs the least introduction, co-founder of Microsoft, the man whose company built Windows into the dominant operating system on the planet, and for decades, the single most recognizable face of proprietary, closed-source commercial software. Under Gates' leadership, Microsoft built its entire business model around controlling and licensing its code tightly, treating the ability to see or modify Windows' underlying source as something only Microsoft itself was ever entitled to do, a philosophy that stood in almost perfect, deliberate opposition to everything Torvalds would go on to build just over a decade later. Linus Torvalds is the other half of the story. And if you're watching a channel like this one, you probably already know exactly who he is, but it's worth restating plainly for the sake of the contrast. In 1991, as a university student in Finland, Torvalds started writing a Unix-like kernel as a personal project and released it to the world with an open invitation for anyone to contribute, modify, and redistribute it freely. That kernel became Linux, and over the following 3.5 decades, it grew into the foundation running the overwhelming majority of the world's servers, most of the internet's infrastructure, Android phones, and as this entire channel has spent the past year documenting, a steadily growing share of desktop computers as well. Torvalds built his reputation not just as a brilliant systems programmer, but as a notoriously blunt, sometimes combative voice in the open source community, unafraid to criticize both Microsoft's business practices and, more recently, some of the excesses of the modern AI industry. A reputation that made him, if anything, an even less likely dinner companion for a former Microsoft CEO than the operating system rivalry alone would suggest. And then there's David Cutler, the third name in that dinner, who might be the least publicly famous of the three, but is arguably just as consequential to this specific story. Cutler is the lead architect of Windows NT, the foundational kernel architecture that modern Windows has been built on top of since the 1990s, replacing the older, more fragile DOS-based Windows architecture entirely. In other words, David Cutler is, in a very real sense, one of the primary designers of the exact operating system Linus Torvalds has spent much of his public career critiquing. Rusinovich's dinner didn't just bring Gates and Torvalds together for the first time. It Also brought together, for the first time, the man who built the modern Windows kernel and the man who built the kernel that has spent 3 decades competing against it. It's worth spending a little more time on Torvalds' own personal story specifically, because the contrast between his path and Gates's path is a huge part of what makes this dinner so symbolically loaded. Gates dropped out of Harvard to build a company that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest people on the planet, built entirely around selling licensed, closed software to businesses and consumers. Torvalds, by contrast, started Linux as an unpaid hobby project, while still a computer science student, originally just trying to build something that would let him better understand the Intel processor architecture in the computer he owned. He posted his early work to a Usenet news group with a now famous, almost comically modest message describing it as just a hobby, it won't be big and professional, a description that turned out to be one of the most spectacularly wrong predictions in the entire history of software. Torvalds never built a company around Linux the way Gates built Microsoft around Windows. He remained for decades, fundamentally a working engineer, still personally reviewing and approving code contributions to the Linux kernel well into his career, maintaining a level of hands-on technical involvement that most founders of software this globally significant abandoned decades before reaching this level of influence. That difference in path, one man building an empire around controlling and selling software, the other maintaining a global, freely available project, largely through the sheer force of his own continued technical leadership, is really the entire philosophical core of the 50-year gap this dinner finally closed. It's not just that Gates and Torvalds happened to work in the same industry without meeting. It's that they represented, for their entire careers, the two most articulate embodiments of a genuine, substantive disagreement about how software should exist in the world at all, as a product to be owned, licensed, and sold, or as a shared, freely modifiable commons anyone could build on top of. It's worth sitting with just how long 50 years of radio silence actually is, because it's easy to type out that number without letting it fully register. Bill Gates co-founded Microsoft in 1975. Linus Torvalds released the first version of Linux in 1991. Between the founding of Microsoft and this dinner in 2025, 5 decades passed. Both men spent that entire time as arguably the two most consequential individual figures in the entire history of operating systems, both attending countless technology conferences, both giving countless interviews, both shaping entire generations of how the world thinks about software. And their paths, according to every account of this dinner, had simply never crossed in person before that evening. That's not really a coincidence, and understanding why requires looking honestly at the specific history of hostility between the world Gates built and the world Torvalds built, because this dinner didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at the end of an extraordinarily long, sometimes genuinely bitter rivalry. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft treated the open source movement, and Linux specifically, as a direct existential threat to its entire business model. Internal Microsoft strategy documents from that era, which later leaked publicly and became known as the Halloween documents, explicitly analyzed open source software as a serious competitive danger and discussed strategies to undermine it. Those documents, once they became public, were treated as damning evidence within the open source community that Microsoft's leadership saw Linux not as a legitimate alternative approach to building software, but as an existential threat to be neutralized through whatever competitive and legal means were available. Microsoft's own leadership at various points used openly hostile language toward Linux specifically, including former CEO Steve Ballmer's infamous comparison of Linux to a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That wasn't a minor offhand remark. It became one of the most widely quoted lines in the entire history of the Windows versus Linux rivalry, repeated constantly by open source advocates for years afterward as proof of exactly how seriously and how negatively Microsoft's leadership viewed the open source movement Torvalds had built. For an entire generation of open source developers and Linux enthusiasts who came up during that era, that single word, cancer, became almost shorthand for Microsoft's institutional stance toward everything Torvalds' project represented. Given that history, the shift required for this dinner to become possible at all represents one of the more remarkable corporate about-faces in modern technology history, the kind of reversal that would have sounded like pure fantasy to anyone reading the Halloween documents at the moment they leaked. Microsoft's public stance toward Linux began changing meaningfully once Satya Nadella took over as CEO in 2014. Nadella, in one of the more quoted moments of his early tenure, stood on stage and declared, with a literal heart symbol projected behind him, that Microsoft loves Linux, a statement that would have been almost unthinkable coming from Microsoft's leadership just a few years earlier, delivered by the same company whose former CEO had publicly compared that exact same software to a disease. In 2016, Microsoft formally joined the Linux Foundation, the nonprofit organization that stewards the ongoing development of the Linux kernel itself, an organization Microsoft had spent years treating as adjacent to a competitive threat rather than a partner worth formally joining. From there, Microsoft's involvement with Linux only deepened year after year in ways that would have seemed almost satirical to suggest a decade earlier. The company began contributing actual code to the Linux kernel, with Microsoft engineers submitting patches and improvements the same way any other Linux Foundation member organization would. It built the Windows subsystem for Linux, letting Windows users run real Linux environments directly inside Windows itself, a tool this channel has covered extensively, including its recent reliability struggles. It built its entire Azure cloud computing business around infrastructure that runs an enormous amount of Linux workloads, to the point where Linux instances now represent a majority of the operating systems actually running on Azure's own servers, meaning Microsoft's own multi-billion-dollar cloud business is, at the infrastructure level, disproportionately dependent on the exact operating system its former leadership once treated as a cancer. And, as we've covered on this channel before, Microsoft has gone as far as building and shipping its own official Linux distribution entirely, Azure Linux, a decision that would have been genuinely unthinkable to imagine coming out of the same company that once compared Linux to a cancer. That's the specific arc of corporate transformation that made this dinner even conceivable, spanning more than a decade of steady, deliberate strategic realignment across nearly every part of Microsoft's business. But it's worth being precise about what this dinner actually was and wasn't, because there's a meaningful difference between a company softening its official corporate stance and the two individual human beings who spent decades as the public faces of that rivalry actually sitting down together. Corporate policy can shift through a boardroom decision and a press release. A 50-year personal gap between two of the most influential people in computing history closing over dinner is a different, more human kind of milestone entirely. And it's exactly why this photograph resonated so strongly across the tech world the moment it was posted. It's worth talking a little about what we actually know and don't know about what happened at that dinner, because the honest answer is that very little of the substantive conversation has been publicly detailed. Rosinovich's own caption was intentionally light and joking. No major kernel decisions were made, but maybe next dinner, which reads as a wink, acknowledging exactly the symbolic weight of the moment without pretending anything more concrete happened than four accomplished people enjoying each other's company. No detailed transcript of their conversation has been published. No joint statement about the future of Windows and Linux came out of it. By every available account, this was simply what it appeared to be on the surface. A private dinner among people who, by pure historical accident, had never previously occupied the same room, finally correcting that gap. That lack of grand pronouncement is, in its own way, part of what makes this story worth telling, rather than something to be disappointed by. It would have been easy and probably tempting for whoever was writing headlines that week to manufacture some grander narrative out of this. A secret alliance, a hidden agenda, some strategic Microsoft maneuver dressed up as a friendly dinner. The more honest, more interesting read is simpler than that. Two people who spent 50 years as symbols of opposing philosophies about how software should be built and distributed, sat down, ate dinner, and by most accounts, simply enjoyed getting to know each other as people rather than as opposing ideologies. Sometimes the more mundane version of a story is the more meaningful one, and resisting the urge to invent a more dramatic version than what actually happened is exactly the kind of restraint this channel tries to hold itself to, even when a juicier, more speculative version would probably generate more attention in the short term. It's worth talking about what we do know about each of these men's more recent public views, because it adds some useful color to what that dinner conversation might plausibly have touched on, even without a transcript. Torvalds has remained a genuinely outspoken, sometimes contrarian voice on where he thinks the tech industry is heading, including on the subject of artificial intelligence, an area where his skepticism stands in fairly sharp contrast to how enthusiastically much of the rest of the industry, Gates very much included, has embraced it. Torvalds has been quoted describing a significant portion of the AI industry's current output as marketing rather than substance, a genuinely blunt characterization from someone whose own career was built on writing real, working code rather than hype. Gates, by contrast, has been one of the more publicly enthusiastic voices about AI's transformative potential in recent years, a genuine philosophical gap between the two men that exists entirely separately from their older operating system rivalry, and one that, if it came up at all over dinner, would have made for a genuinely interesting conversation between two people with very different instincts about where computing is actually headed next. Let's talk about David Cutler's presence at this dinner a bit more too, because his inclusion adds a layer to this story that's easy to overlook if you're not already familiar with his specific place in computing history. Cutler didn't just work on Windows in some general sense. He's widely credited as the primary architect behind the NT kernel, the deep, architectural foundation that every version of Windows since Windows NT in the early 1990s has been built on top of, including the version of Windows running on whatever machine you might be watching this on. Before that, Cutler had already built a legendary reputation in the computing world for his earlier work on operating systems at Digital Equipment Corporation, including systems that influenced an entire generation of operating system design well beyond just what eventually became Windows. Bringing Cutler into this same dinner meant that the specific architectural lineage of modern Windows itself, not just Microsoft as a corporate entity, was represented at that table, sitting across from the person whose own kernel has spent over 3 decades as Windows' most significant open-source alternative. Cutler and Torvalds meeting for the first time is, in its own quieter way, just as historically loaded as Gates and Torvalds meeting, because it's the literal architects of the 2 most consequential operating system kernels in modern computing history finally in the same room, likely capable of having a far more technically detailed conversation about kernel design philosophy than either of them could have had with Gates, who moved into a more business and philanthropic role decades before this dinner ever took place. In a sense, the most technically substantive conversation possible at that entire table may well have happened between Cutler and Torvalds specifically. 2 working systems architects meeting for the first time, despite having spent their entire careers building the 2 operating systems most directly positioned as each other's rivals. It's worth asking what this dinner actually signals about the broader relationship between Microsoft and the Linux world going forward, because that's really the question underneath all the surface-level charm of the photograph itself. And it's a question worth taking seriously rather than just enjoying the image at face value. On one hand, it would be a mistake to read too much strategic significance into a single social dinner. Corporate rivalries and genuine philosophical differences about how software should be, built and distributed, don't dissolve simply because a handful of individuals share a nice meal together. Microsoft and the broader open source community still have plenty of real, ongoing tension. This channel has spent an entire year documenting specific current examples of exactly that friction, from WSL's repeated reliability failures to secure boot certificate transitions, breaking dual boot Linux systems, to Microsoft's own developer tools quietly underserving Linux users again and again. But on the other hand, dismissing this dinner as pure symbolism with zero substance underneath it would also miss something genuinely real. Relationships between organizations are, underneath all the corporate structure, still built out of relationships between actual people. And the fact that Gates and Torvalds had spent 50 years as figureheads of an entire industry's central ideological argument, without ever once sitting down together, says something honest about just how deep that divide used to run. The fact that a senior Microsoft executive specifically arranged for that gap to finally close, and felt it significant enough to document and share publicly rather than let pass quietly, suggests that, at least within Microsoft's current leadership, this meeting was understood as something worth actively creating and celebrating, not just a coincidental social outcome that happened to occur and got photographed afterward. There's also something worth noting about how this story was received across the wider tech community once it went public, because the reaction itself tells you something about how deeply this 50-year gap had actually settled into the industry's collective memory. Coverage of the dinner appeared across nearly every major technology outlet, from PC World to Tom's Hardware to The Verge to multiple international publications, translated and picked up across Europe and beyond, each treating it as genuinely newsworthy rather than a minor footnote buried at the bottom of a slow news day. That volume of coverage, for what was, on paper, just a private dinner between 4 people, reflects just how much symbolic weight the Windows versus Linux rivalry has carried across the entire history of personal computing, and how rare it is for that rivalry's 2 most iconic human faces to generate a moment this simple and this human. Comment sections across nearly every one of those articles, filled with a mixture of genuine warmth and, predictably, no shortage of jokes about kernel panics and licensing disputes. A fitting reaction from a community that has spent decades taking this particular rivalry both extremely seriously and, at the same time, never quite losing its sense of humor about it. So, where does this actually leave things, looking back at this dinner now, more than a year removed from when it happened? It didn't resolve the deeper structural tensions this channel has spent the past year documenting in detail. Microsoft's own products still repeatedly underserve Linux users. The philosophical gap between open and closed software development still shapes real business decisions on both sides, and nothing about one dinner changes any of the specific ongoing conflicts we've covered. WSL still broke twice within a matter of months for developers relying on it. Secure boot certificate transitions still quietly complicated dual boot systems with minimal warning. The pattern of Microsoft's own tools treating Linux compatibility as an afterthought didn't stop. simply because its founder shared a meal with Linux's creator. If anything, holding both of these truths at once, a genuinely warm, symbolically significant human moment between two industry icons, alongside a long list of very real, ongoing corporate friction between the platforms they represent, is a more honest way to understand where this relationship actually stands than either extreme would be on its own. But it's still worth remembering as exactly what it was. A quiet, human moment of closure to one of the longest-running unresolved gaps in the personal history of an entire industry, between two men whose decisions, made independently and often in direct opposition to each other, shaped how billions of people around the world have interacted with computers for the past 50 years. There's something genuinely worth appreciating in the fact that, after 5 decades of building competing philosophies, competing products, and at times genuinely hostile corporate rhetoric between the companies and communities they represented, the two men at the actual center of that story turned out to be capable of simply sitting down and enjoying each other's company once the opportunity finally arose. Industries can carry grudges much longer than people do. This dinner is a reminder that the human beings behind history's biggest rivalries are often far more willing to move past them than the institutions built in their names ever seem to be. If you want to see the fuller picture of how the Microsoft-Linux relationship actually plays out today, in all its genuine remaining tension, the other videos on this channel covering WSL's reliability problems, secure boot certificate issues, and Microsoft's broader pattern of treating Linux support as an afterthought are linked right here, because the real current relationship between these two worlds is far more complicated than one friendly dinner photo might suggest. Let me know in the comments what you think Gates and Torvalds might have actually talked about at that table, or which other historic tech rivals you'd want to see finally share a meal together. There's no shortage of candidates across this industry's history who spent decades as public rivals without ever crossing paths in person. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking both the genuine conflicts and the occasional, genuinely human moments that make up the full, complicated story of Microsoft and Linux's 50-year relationship.